The topic of this lecture is playing and publishing in Shakespeare's England. This is a longer lecture than normal. We're going to cover three different things, three components to this. The first one, we're going to be talking about the Renaissance theater more generally, and then move on to talking about some of the known facts of Shakespeare's life, and then the last third or so of the video will cover early Shakespearean texts. So before we get into that, I think it would be helpful to have some historical background, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but there will be four areas that will provide some context for understanding Shakespeare and his plays. And those areas are government, religion, conflicts, and by conflicts I mean major military engagements, and city life. So we'll start by talking about government, and Shakespeare's life spanned the reigns of two monarchs. The first, Queen Elizabeth I, who acceded in 1558. This was about 6 years before Shakespeare was born, and she would rule until her death in 1603. And this period is known as the Elizabethan period. She never married, and never gave birth to an heir to the throne. So when she died, there was a succession crisis. Who is going to replace Elizabeth? And it had already been worked out, actually, that her cousin, James Stuart, would accede to the throne. He was the first Stuart monarch. So Queen Elizabeth was the last Tudor, and James Stuart was obviously the first Stuart monarch. And he could trace his family ancestry matrilineally back to Henry VII, his great-great-grandfather, the first Tudor monarch. And he would rule from 1603 until his death in 1625. And this is referred to as the Jacobean period. Religion was clearly, at that time, an important part of daily life. In 1534, Queen Elizabeth's father, King Henry VIII, ended England's relationship with Papal Rome and declared himself head of the new Church of England. This was called royal supremacy, and it was brought about basically by his desire to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and to marry his second wife, Anne Boleyn. And this occurred in the context of the wider religious reform movement known as the Protestant Reformation. Henry's only son and successor, Edward VI, continued these Protestant reforms during his very brief reign from 1547 to 53. He died, he was still a teenager, in fact, when he died, and his older sister, known as Bloody Mary, a staunch Catholic, this was a daughter of Henry VIII's first wife, she reversed many of these Protestant reforms. After her death in 1558, her younger half-sister, Queen Elizabeth, a daughter of Anne Boleyn, put England back on a Protestant footing, much to the dismay of Catholics who were once again persecuted and driven underground. So these religious upheavals in a very short span of time contributed to many of the wars, insurrections, and assassination plots that clouded the reigns of both Elizabeth and James. So talking then about some of these conflicts, during the second half of the 16th century, the greatest foreign national security threat to England was Spain. a Catholic country with the most powerful military in Europe, particularly their navy, the famous Spanish Armada. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain, who had briefly been married to Mary Tudor, Queen Mary, until her death in 1558, attempted to invade England and depose the Protestant Queen Elizabeth. This was an ill-fated venture. It ended with the celebrated defeat of the Spanish Armada with a little help from Mother Nature. Meanwhile, England was supporting Protestant rebels in the Low Countries and the Netherlands who were fighting for their independence from Catholic Spain. So closer to home, there was constant unrest in Ireland during this period. Ireland was predominantly Catholic, but had been claimed by Henry VIII in 1542 and occupied by Protestant English settlers who, as the century progressed, resorted to increasingly violent genocidal policies to pacify the local Irish population. The Desmond Rebellions and the Nine Years' War, these were major conflicts that occupied much of Elizabeth's reign. There were also civil wars on English soil, particularly in the north part of the country, where disaffected Catholics conspired to overthrow Elizabeth and replace her with her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was imprisoned and eventually beheaded. After Elizabeth's death, Mary, Queen of Scots' son, James Stuart, would accede to the throne as King James VI of Scotland, actually a title that he had acquired earlier in his life, and now also King James I of England. This was called the Union of the Crowns. Finally, talking about city life, which is where much of the epicenter, it was the epicenter of English theater culture. London, in the late 16th century, was among the largest and fastest growing cities in Europe. By 1600, the population was roughly 200,000, with 10,000 more or so coming in every year. Its location on the River Thames, with direct access to the North Sea and the trading routes, primarily to the Low Countries, made it a financial and commercial hub for the entire country. It was also the axis of political power, of course, and artistic and literary culture. London was a place painters could find wealthy clients who could pay handsomely to have their portraits painted and their lavish homes decorated. It was also the epicenter of English literary production, with most of the print industry located around St. Paul's Cathedral. We'll talk more about that a little later in this lecture. The city itself was governed by a group called the Corporation, which included the Lord Mayor, the Court of Aldermen, and the Court of the Common Council. And collectively, they oversaw all city affairs, including, but not without significant resistance, the regulation of public theaters. And we'll talk a lot more about that in a few minutes. So here is a very famous engraving, a panorama of London in 1616. This was the year that Shakespeare died, but this gives us a really good idea of what London looked like during the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods. I'll point out just a few of the interesting structures here. Over on the right is the Tower of London, which that building with the four cupolas on the corner towers, that building still stands today. It's the White Tower. The tower was a royal residence, also contained a famous dungeon, and many state executions took place there. And I think it's the only structure I'm going to show you that's still standing today. Spanning the Thames is, of course, London Bridge, which, as you can see at that time, was heavily built up with private residences, commercial space. There was even a church on the bridge. And at the south end of it there, you can see the gate, which I'll blow up a little bit there. And on top of it were the heads of traders stuck on poles. So anyone entering the city, that would be your greeting, is seeing the heads of enemies of the state lowering down at you as you passed through the gate. Someone at one point around 1600, I think, counted 30 heads up there, but they could stay. They did stay for years and years. I think in some cases, decades. They would just mummify up there in the elements. Off to the left, in a little more distant, is St. Paul's Cathedral. By the time this engraving was made, it had lost the steeple over its central tower. And this is old St. Paul's. This is this church. The rest of it burnt down in the Great Fire of London in 1666 and was rebuilt. So the St. Paul's there today is not the St. Paul's that was there in Shakespeare's time. And again, I'm pointing out St. Paul's because the Stationers' Company had its offices near there, and because of that, the area around that neighborhood of St. Paul's was the epicenter of printing and publishing and bookselling in London. Down at the bottom, on the near bank of the River Thames, the arrow there is pointing at the Swan Theater, which we're going to talk a lot more about later in this video as sort of a representative of Elizabethan outdoor theaters. And as you can see, just looking along the south bank there, this area was called the Bankside, and you can see other theater buildings there. And I will blow up this section right here so that you can see it a little better. There on the left is an entertainment venue at that time, apparently called the Bear Garden, and this was a place where people could pay money to watch poor bears tied to stakes and being set upon by hunting dogs who antagonized the bears. And apparently this was great entertainment. You could see somebody walking their dog up to the Bear Garden there. But the more important structure for this particular subject is the Globe on the right. And this was, of course, the theater that was associated with Shakespeare's theater company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and it opened in 1599. And the flag being up there is an indication that a performance was underway. And this is going to be a segue for us to start talking about Renaissance theater. So we'll start by talking about what was going on in theater before Shakespeare's time. Elizabethan drama didn't just emerge out of nowhere. So what were some of the precursors for it? Well, in the early 16th century, there were a handful of itinerant professional acting troupes, but most performances appear to have been ad hoc in nature, organized and funded primarily by civic officials and clergymen. Actors were largely amateurs, recruited from the local populace, and stages tended to be crude and temporary, and many of them were mobile. They could move on wheels. A good example of the type of performance that would have been seen at that time is the pageant of the Nine Worthies in Act 5 of Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost. The two most popular kinds of plays, however, were mystery plays and morality plays. These were medieval plays, and neither mystery nor morality plays bear much resemblance to the humanist Renaissance drama of the later 16th century, but certainly influenced it. And so we need to talk about these two forms of dramatic entertainment. The first, mystery plays, depicted biblical stories all the way from Adam and Eve up to the apocalypse. The performances, there were other performances that depicted the lives of saints. These were called miracle plays. These types of plays, mystery plays and miracle plays, were often incorporated directly into church services or staged during annual religious festivals. Originally, in the beginning, they were organized and performed by local clergy to make the scriptures and Latin liturgy intelligible to unlettered lay audiences. But by the 15th century, the mysteries had become secularized. And the main reason for that is that they were being financed and performed no longer by just the clergy, but by local craft and trade guilds. So plays were relocated from the naves and choirs of churches to village marketplaces and guild halls. Scripts were written in vernacular languages, French and English, and began introducing non-biblical secondary characters, often for comedic purposes. These plays, mysteries and miracles, were associated with popular Catholic piety, so they declined in popularity after the Protestant Reformation. Less bound to scriptural sources than the mysteries, morality plays presented dramatic allegories of spiritual struggle and salvation. A typical example of a morality play would involve personifications of virtue and vice, contending for the soul of a poor everyman figure. Morality plays, therefore, appealed more to Protestant sensibilities, and during the 16th century, they fared somewhat better than the earlier religious drama. And morality plays influenced Christopher Marlowe most obviously in his most famous play, Dr. Faustus. And it's quite likely that a young Shakespeare saw morality plays performed in his hometown of Stratford-upon-Avon. So besides these popular religious manifestations of medieval theater, a dramatic performance was an important aspect of the more refined world of the Tudor court, and it tended more towards secular themes, drawing on elements of Greco-Roman antiquity, chivalric romance, and local folklore traditions. Two important forms of royal entertainment persisted into Shakespeare's time: pageants and masks. So we'll talk about these more secular dramatic entertainments, pageants and masks, because they would have an influence on Shakespeare. So during the summer months, kings and queens during this period would tour the English countryside with their entire royal household in tow. This could involve a couple of hundred carts and wagons. And they would stay at various castles and manor houses along their route, and their arrival would be met with spectacular pageants that included fireworks, music and dance, and theatrical entertainment written specifically for the occasion. As a boy, Shakespeare may actually have witnessed one of the most famous pageants ever, the pageant of 1575, when Robert Dudley hosted Queen Elizabeth at Kenilworth, not far from Shakespeare's home at Stratford. So masks, composed for private celebratory occasions, typically weddings, masks involved role play. They involved singing and music, and most importantly, dance. With some exceptions, parts were played by amateurs selected from amongst the host family and invited guests, while spectators were expected to participate in the singing and dancing. So much different from going to a theater to watch a dramatic performance and sitting and watching a performance on stage. Masks involved more audience participation. Shakespeare portrays a mask at the court of the King of Navarre in Act 5 of Love's Labour's Lost. As time went on, particularly in the early 17th century and the Jacobean period, mask productions became increasingly lavish with richly detailed scene decoration, elaborate special effects and stage machinery and floats. And during the Stuart monarchy, notable poets and playwrights, Ben Jonson, Samuel Daniel, George Chapman, they were all commissioned to compose the literary settings for these elaborate productions. John Milton would write one of the most famous masks, Comus, a little later in the 17th century. So the emergence of humanist drama then, how did we get from miracles and moralities and mysteries to humanist drama? There are books written about this, and I'm not going to pretend that what I'm going to share with you here is exhaustive by any means, but there are 4 general trends that one could take a look at. An emergent print culture, public education, the Inns of Court in London, and then the city itself, urban growth. And I'll talk about each of these categories for just a moment. So starting with print culture, the Reformation may have accelerated the decline of religious drama in Europe, but it also energized a thriving mercantile print culture. Book production in medieval times had been in the monasteries, where for centuries monks sat in their scriptoria copying books out by hand. And so the book production moved into urban printing houses that were outfitted with new mechanical presses that could produce books at relatively remarkable speeds compared to the old method of handwritten books. The proliferation and accessibility of print materials during this period then facilitated lay literacy. More people could read, and this was a cornerstone of Protestant theology. It also made available secular texts, including not just the poetry and drama of ancient Greece and Rome, but also the more contemporary vernacular literatures of continental Europe. So, education. So while fierce debates over religion and the social upheaval and strife those debates spawned were the impetus for a good deal of the writing and publishing going on in the 16th century, there were other developments in commercial trade, in banking, and colonial expansion that also exerted tremendous pressure on feudal institutions to modernize. So this period saw the rapid bureaucratization of government agencies, and it required a steady influx of literate men to keep these agencies functioning. So after the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s under King Henry VIII, church assets were used to open public schools across the kingdom, and this really accelerated under Henry VIII's son. And these schools provided commoners with educational opportunities to prepare them for careers in government service. Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and others, they all benefited from these schools, where Latin, which was still the language of law and international diplomacy, was taught from the texts of ancient poets and playwrights. So giving these intellectual men the exposure that would certainly impact their own literary production later in life. The Inns of Court. So after attending university, young men who chose not to enter the clerical ranks typically traveled to London to study law at one of the 4 Inns of Court, and they were Gray's Inn, Lincoln's Inn, the Inner Temple, and Middle Temple. And because they came from the universities, had a university education, Plays were routinely performed during the winter months at the Inns of Court as a form of entertainment, and this helped to develop a secular theater culture in London that appealed to the literary tastes of the well-educated. One of the most famous early plays, Thomas Norton and Thomas Sackville's tragedy Gorboduc. This was the first play composed in blank verse, the form for which Shakespeare is well known, and the first play to draw its subject matter from English history, and it was performed at the Inns of Court at the Inner Temple in 1561, which was 3 years before Shakespeare was born. In fact, Queen Elizabeth herself attended a performance of Gorboduc at the Inner Temple. Shakespeare himself had plays performed at the Inns of Court. Comedy of Errors, we know, was performed at Gray's Inn in 1594. So while the Inns of Court provided these early theater companies with a regular venue and financial support, the wider city promised more. People were drawn to London by financial opportunity. They had sophisticated tastes, and they had money to spend. So while theatrical entertainment was stifled within the city proper, and that's something we'll talk more about in a little while, outside its walls, the first permanent theater venues began to appear in the 1570s. Some of the best-known theaters, including Shakespeare's Globe Theater, were erected on the south bank of the River Thames, the Bankside, as you saw in the Panorama of London that I showed you earlier. During Shakespeare's career, there were always at least 4 dedicated theaters, and at one point as many as 9. Now, larger ones, they could hold up to 3,000 spectators, so this was a major form of popular entertainment in Shakespeare's time. It was big business, and without a large urban population to support it, we probably would not have William Shakespeare. So, opposition to the theaters. Not everyone was happy about this popular form of entertainment. By the end of the period, acting was, for the most part, a legitimate profession. However, in the early days of Tudor theater, actors enjoyed no legal status. They were treated basically as vagabonds and were subject to very stringent laws that imposed harsh punishments on the unemployed. These punishments could involve everything from public whipping to enslavement. So, to protect themselves from these laws, acting troupes sought the protection of the nobility, and noblemen liked to have theater companies to entertain their households during the Christmas season, especially. So these acting companies would seek out noblemen in whose service they were employed, and this was a practice that continued into the Caroline period, the period after King James, when his son Charles I was King of England. So thus, early in his career, Shakespeare was affiliated with companies with names like Lord Strang's Men and the Earl of Pembroke's Men. And this relationship between players and the social elite created tension between the Queen's Privy Council and the Corporation of London, which worked vigorously throughout this period, ceaselessly, to suppress the theaters. And eventually, they would succeed when they shut the theaters down in 1642 at the beginning of the English Civil War. But that was long after Shakespeare's time. It was these efforts of the corporation that led acting companies, theater companies, to build the first permanent theatrical venues outside corporate jurisdiction in the suburbs, which were called liberties at the time, starting in the mid-1570s. So what were the grounds for the opposition? Some of them are, you could probably expect. There was the perceived moral and spiritual corruption associated with the theater. concerns over lewdness, licentiousness, blasphemy. These were the favorite buggies of the theater critics at the time. And there were several areas of concern recognized by both the Privy Council and the Corporation of London, and those are certainly worth taking a closer look at. I'm going to zero in on 5. Public health, the first. Riotousness and sedition. Crime. Religious interference. And idleness. So we'll talk briefly about each of these. Starting with public health, which was probably the most serious. We're talking about plague, essentially. Public health was the most pressing concern of the period. So while the science of contagion was poorly understood, they recognized that crowded, filthy conditions facilitated the spread of disease. So during periods of plague, which were quite frequent, theaters were closed indefinitely. And during Shakespeare's period, this happened almost every other year, it seemed. So typically they reopened after a few months, but on several occasions, at least 3 that I can think of, they remained closed for almost a year, a couple times a little more than a year. And this obviously put tremendous pressure on the theater companies. Riotousness and sedition. So another area of concern was the disorderliness of the theater crowds. There were several incidents, big incidents, small riots, fights, which raised the specter of popular unrest and insurrection. So compound that with concerns that performances critical of the church or government could make already unruly crowds especially flammable. This prompted the Privy Council and the Corporation of London to agree that there was a need for regulation of the content of the plays, for censoring of plays that were intended for public performance. Eventually, this responsibility fell on the Privy Council, and a position known as the Master of the Revels took over supervision of plays. And we'll talk more about the Master of the Revels in just a few minutes. Crime was a big concern. Theatrical entertainment brought together citizens from nearly every rank of society. I don't think the nobility attended the public theaters, but anyone, with money could go. So this created opportunities for criminal activity, both inside and outside the theaters and inns where plays were performed. Pickpockets, prostitutes, and sundry other rogues found large, distracted crowds to be ideal for their purposes, and even the playwrights themselves sometimes incorporated this knowledge into their plays. I'm thinking of The Roaring Girl, which where reference is made to the criminal element of theater crowds. Religious interference. So a frequent source of conflict between the theaters and city officials was the performance of plays during church services. There were numerous attempts, starting in the 1570s and going on in the 1590s, to prohibit performances on Sundays and holy days. These bans were often ignored, and therefore it appears that they were not easy to enforce. So the competition between church and theater was obviously a sore spot for city officials and church leaders. And finally, there's idleness. Dramatic entertainment was denounced as a frivolous waste of one's money and time. A wastefulness that threatened an already strained social and domestic order. So, as most public performances took place during daytime hours, they didn't have electricity, of course. So, plays were generally performed during the daytime. And so young apprentices wouldn't go to work. They would shirk their employers, students ditched their school books, and women slipped out of the home, none of which, of course, pleased the authorities in London. So the Master of the Revels. This is not a portrait of the Master of the Revels. This is King James looking very dour. The Master of the Revels. So the Master of the Revels was an officer of the royal household reporting to the Lord Chamberlain. This is a position that had existed since probably the end of the 15th century, but by the middle of the 16th century had become permanent. His primary duties were to organize and oversee court entertainments, including theatrical performance. Edmund Tilney was appointed Master of the Revels in 1578 or 79 and retained the position throughout most of Shakespeare's playwriting career. Throughout this period, the Master of the Revels acquired more and more authority over plays. In 1581, his office expanded to stage censor, responsible for reviewing and licensing all plays performed at public theaters. And by the time Tilney's successor, George Buck, assumed the mastership in 1610, the office had further extended its oversight to the printing of plays. So this, the Master of the Revels was effectively a censor during this period. And we'll talk now about playwrights, playing companies, and theater owners. So playwrights did not enjoy the cultural prestige or legal protections afforded to authors today. For moral as well as artistic reasons, popular drama was not taken as seriously as poetry was. A fair analogy, perhaps, is the way contemporary society regards comic books and video games today. Also, playwrights did not benefit financially from the rights to their work. Once they'd written a play and sold it to a company, the author had little control over what happened to the play next. Further complicating ownership of the plays, playwrights often collaborated together. So several of Shakespeare's plays, The Two Noble Kinsmen, for instance, were written in partnership with other playwrights, probably as an expedient to meet deadlines imposed by the companies. No play text was sacred either. Scripts were frequently altered over time. Sometimes these revisions were done by the original playwright, but just as often they were done by someone else. After Shakespeare's death, a playwright named Thomas Middleton became the house playwright for the King's Men, and he made significant changes to a number of Shakespeare's plays and inserted some of his own material into them. Macbeth is a good example of that. So a playing company then consisted of a core of actors, all male. Women would not be allowed to perform until after the Restoration. And the actors collectively owned the entire repertory of plays. They also shared the stage properties and the wardrobe. And actually, the wardrobe was a company's greatest expense. In addition to the main actors who were shareholders in the company, spot performers were often hired as needed, and adolescent boys were apprenticed to play the parts of women and children. And this was another concern of the London aldermen, who thought that these theater companies were pederast, some of them, and corrupting young boys. Profits from performances were divided proportionally among the shareholders. Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, at one point had 9 shareholders. of whom Shakespeare was one. So prior to the Globe Theater, which was a company-owned playhouse, playing companies did not own the expensive buildings they occupied. The owners tended to be entrepreneurs, not actors, and they took a substantial cut of the company's proceeds. Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, originally used two venues in the northern suburb of Shoreditch. These theaters were called the Theater and the Curtain. Both of these theaters were owned and or operated by James Burbage, whose son Richard was the most famous actor of the time. In 1596, in addition to the theater in Shoreditch, Burbage also acquired the largest indoor theater in London, the Blackfriars Theater, although Shakespeare's company would be prohibited from performing there until 1610. Right after Burbage bought it, the Corporation of London successfully banned adult performances within the city limits, so they could not use their indoor theater until 1610. And by that point, James Burbage was dead, and his theater properties had been passed on to his sons, Richard Burbage and Cuthbert. So this very famous drawing is a drawing of the Swan Theater. This was the third permanent theater built on the Bankside. The other two were the Rose Theater and Newington Butts. This theater opened in 1596, 3 years before the Globe Theater, a little further east on the Bankside. This is not an original drawing, but a copy, a contemporary copy. And it's the only picture we have of the interior of an Elizabethan theater, and based on a drawing by a Dutch humanist scholar by the name of De Witt. Here is, the first theater company to occupy this site, the Swan Theater, was the Earl of Pembroke's men. The Earl of Pembroke, Henry Herbert, the second Earl of Pembroke. This was Mary Sidney's husband. This is Philip Sidney's sister. So Philip Sidney's brother-in-law, the second Earl of Pembroke. But within a year of occupying this theater, there was a satirical play produced. We've lost that play, unfortunately. It's one of sort of the grail finds of Renaissance literature studies, called The Isle of Dogs. And this led to the imprisonment of several actors, including Ben Jonson, who had co-authored the play with Thomas Nash. So let's talk a little bit about what someone would experience attending a theater during the Elizabethan period. Here's what a reconstruction of the theater looks like today. This is the modern Globe Theater, very near the site of Shakespeare's Globe Theater on the Bankside. And they tried to replicate it almost down to the beam. You know, they've got the thatched roof, and it's a round open air theater, pretty primitive. I'm sure that there are all kinds of codes and things that had to be followed in case of a fire or something, but which was a danger in Elizabethan times. And in fact, Shakespeare's theater did burn down. We'll talk about that later. But as you can see, a roughly round, nearly circular structure. And so it was on the inside as well. So let's talk a little bit about the parts of the theater. We'll start with the main stage area. So later theaters had partially roofed stages. The ceilings could be decorated with celestial bodies like what you see here. This is the roof of the ceiling of the modern Globe Theater. There could be a trap door that would allow stage machinery to drop down from above for special effects. And some of Shakespeare's later plays provide indications of such effects. And then an elevated stage extended into what was called the yard. A trapdoor could also be in the stage to allow for surprise entrances and exits, as well as other stage effects. This wall in the back of the stage with the two doors led to an enclosed area called the tiring room. This is where actors changed costumes between scenes and waited for their cues to re-enter the action on stage. The wall of the tiring room facing the audience could be decorated with scene paintings, of course. And on top of the tiring room, you see some people seated there in a little gallery. This was a balcony above and behind the stage. It could be used by the actors during a performance, or perhaps musicians, or it could be used to provide additional super premium seating. We know that these balconies were used for that at the time. At the top, there was a little hut, and on the day of a performance, a flag was raised atop the theater to let everyone know that a performance was taking place, and a trumpeter would come out and blast his trumpet to signal when a performance was about to begin, and that is still the way it's done, I understand, at the Modern Globe Theater. The most expensive seats were in these galleries, and there were generally 3 of them, with bench seating for the spectators, and the higher galleries cost more. You can see that the entrance to the galleries was on the inside of the theaters with these stairways, which basically made the entire theater a massive fire hazard. And it's miraculous that we don't have any records of one of these theaters catching on fire and burning down with everyone inside. As far as I know, there were no external entrances into these galleries, which could seat hundreds, if not thousands, of people. In front and around the stage, this was the cheapest admission, a penny, and it got spectators into the yard, and sometimes they're referred to as groundlings. They were close to the stage, which one would think would be premium, but they had to stand, and they were crowded together, and they were exposed to the weather. So the hot sunshine, or if it was drizzly or wet, they would be exposed to the elements. So close to the stage, but not necessarily a pleasant experience. Plus, I think it smelled terrible. So here is a photograph of a performance of Shakespeare at the Modern Globe Theater, and you can see that the yard around the stage is pretty well packed with people. You can see that the stage itself is pretty sparse, and this is consistent with Renaissance performances. They didn't have a lot of expensive stage props. Most of the expense went to costuming. So at this point, we'll talk a little bit about Shakespeare's life. There are lots of gaps in his biography that are very difficult to fill in. One of the most intriguing ones being his move from his hometown, Stratford-upon-Avon, to London, and that's sort of the early days of his theater career. There's a lot of that part of his life is shrouded in mystery. But we do know a few facts about his life, some of which are pertinent to his plays. And so what we'll do now is talk about who was Shakespeare, and we'll put together a chronology of known facts about his life. We know that he was born around April the 23rd, 1564. He was the 3rd child and the eldest son of John Shakespeare and his wife, Mary. There is Shakespeare's childhood home, as it stands today, in Stratford-upon-Avon. And his father, John, was a successful middle-class landowner, well-liked in the community, dabbled in small business, money lending, and agricultural ventures. He was, like I said, he was esteemed within the community, and after the birth of William was elected bailiff of Stratford. This was the highest office in municipal government. His business sense and his political savvy certainly rubbed off on his son, who was a fantastic businessman. But these activities also provided numerous opportunities for young William to observe various kinds of performance, not just theatrical performance up close, political spectacles during election seasons or church rituals, and then, of course, theatrical entertainments, which his father, as bailiff, would have had a role in coordinating for the village. In the 1570s, Shakespeare probably attends King Edward VI school, starting around the age of 7 and continuing until the age of 14. This is the Guildhall in Stratford, where the school was located. This was formerly a religious school that prepared Catholics to take holy orders, but the new schools created by the staunchly Protestant Edward VI offered middle-class boys a secular education grounded in Latin study. So as a student there, Shakespeare would have been exposed to Roman drama, the comedies of Plautus and the tragedies of Seneca, and that Latin dramatic tradition is evident in some of Shakespeare's earliest plays, and also the poetry of Ovid. Very, very important to Shakespeare's development, both as a poet and a dramatist. At 18 years old, in 1582, he marries a woman named Anne Hathaway, who's older than he is, and she's already 3 months pregnant with their first child at the time of their marriage. His first daughter, Susanna, was born in 1583. She was followed 2 years later by fraternal twins, Hamnet and Judith. And Hamnet, Shakespeare's only son, died in 1596. He was just 11 years old when he passed away. Susanna married in 1607, and Judith married hastily and somewhat controversially in 1616, just weeks before William Shakespeare died. In 1592, now 28 years old, we know Shakespeare's in London at this point. He's involved in the theater world. The terms, the how, the who, a lot we don't know about this. But by this point, by 1592, he is acting and writing successful plays for established companies like Lord Strang's Men and the Earl of Sussex's Men. With London theaters shut down in 1593, a massive outbreak of plague occurred that year. Probably to keep income flowing, Shakespeare publishes 2 narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. Both of these poems were written under the patronage of Henry Wriothesley, or Risley, the Earl of Southampton. There he is. A fantastic hair he has there. These 2 poems really established Shakespeare's reputation as one of England's premier poets. He was quite famous for these for many years before he was famous as a playwright. In 1594, Titus Andronicus becomes his first published play, although qualify that by saying his name does not actually appear on the title page or anywhere in the quarto edition of the play, but this was his first published play. And in the year 1594, he begins his professional affiliation with a new theater company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and we'll talk more about that. So the Lord Chamberlain's Men was chartered in 1594 by Henry Carey, the first Baron Huston, who served as Queen Elizabeth's Lord Chamberlain. This was a senior position in the royal household. The Lord Chamberlain was a member of the Privy Council. So to have your company sponsored by someone of this stature this would make this one of the premier theater companies in England. When Carey died in 1596, the company patent transferred to his son George, who would himself become Lord Chamberlain the following year. And in between, the company was known simply as Lord Husband's Men. We have very few records of the roles that Shakespeare performed. We know that he was an actor. We know that he did play a part in Ben Jonson's play, Every Man in His Humor. But we don't have anything to show that he ever performed in his own plays, although one might assume that he did. But he probably did not play any lead roles. Richard Burbage was the most prominent actor in the company and one of the most talented working in all of London at that time, which means that Shakespeare probably did not take on any leading roles. And he was busy writing plays anyway, 2 a year at one point. In 1596, he successfully applies to the Herald's College for a family coat of arms. I mention this because it's an expensive process, and it would have elevated his family to the gentry. What it shows, I think, is that Shakespeare was successful, that he was making a lot of money as an actor and playwright in Lord Chamberlain's Men. This was to get a family coat of arms was something his father had wished for but couldn't achieve, and Shakespeare was able to fulfill that family dream in 1596. Similarly, in 1597, he makes a major purchase, one of the largest houses in Stratford called New Place. He buys it the next year. Sort of an interesting side story about this is that the sale was complicated by the murder of the previous owner. His name was William Underhill. He was killed by his son, and this delayed Shakespeare's acquisition of the property. And once he bought this house, this began a period of many years going into the early 17th century when Shakespeare was buying up large parcels of adjacent land, building a rather large estate well into the 17th century. In 1598, this was the year that we see the first quarto editions of plays in which Shakespeare is actually identified as the author. So you see there Love's Labour's Lost, the 1598 quarto edition, and there is William Shakespeare named right on the title page. In 1599, the Globe Theater, this was the company-owned theater of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, opens on the Bankside, and it is competing with neighboring theaters, the Swan, which we've already talked about, and another theater called the Rose. And the Rose Theater was occupied by probably the second most well-known theater company in London, and a rival of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, the Lord Admiral's Men. This is a company that Christopher Marlowe had once been associated with before he was killed. So when James Burbage died in 1597, his two sons, Richard the actor and brother Cuthbert, a younger brother, I believe, inherited the theater and Blackfriars. And for a time, the Lord Chamberlain's Men relocated from the theater to a nearby theater called the Curtain, which was also owned by Burbage's business partner, Henry Landman. This was because of some disputes over the theater, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Meanwhile, the Blackfriars Theater, which the company now also owned, would sit unused until the rules prohibiting performance within the city limits of London were relaxed. Going back to the theater, a fierce dispute over the lease of this property, which was in the northern liberty of Shoreditch, a very, very fierce legal dispute over the lease of the property on which the theater was built, famously resulted in the Burbages Richard and Cuthbert saying fine, and they claimed the right of ownership to the building itself, and they dismantled the entire thing over the Christmas holidays and moved it from Shoreditch across the Thames to the Bankside, and used the materials to build the Globe Theatre. This was the first company-owned theatre. So in 1601, Shakespeare's company became embroiled in a quite serious matter called the Essex Rebellion. Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, this is the brother of Lady Penelope Rich. This is the Stella of Sidney's famous sonnet sequence, Astrophil and Stella. So her brother, Lady Penelope Rich's brother, Robert Devereux, was at one point a favorite of Queen Elizabeth, and she tasked him with going to Ireland to deal with the troubles over there, and he failed miserably and did not succeed in any of the military campaigns that he attempted. And when he came home, he felt humiliated, not by his defeats alone, but also by his treatment back at home. And so this led him to plan a rebellion to overthrow the queen. And there was actually a date. It was to take place on February the 8th of 1601. Where Shakespeare gets implicated in this is the night before the rebellion was to take place, his company was paid double their usual rate for a special performance of Shakespeare's play Richard II, which depicts the deposition and murder of an English monarch. The players were interrogated. They claimed they didn't know anything about this. They didn't know about the rebellion, and they were ultimately found innocent. And they would perform for the Queen on the eve of Essex's execution. So the play was actually performed before an audience of Devereux's sympathizers and co-conspirators. And again, it implicated Shakespeare's company in the failed coup. But they were successful at claiming their ignorance of this rebellion. Hamlet may have been completed by this date, which marks the beginning of the period of Shakespeare's great tragedies, which culminated with Macbeth in 1606. So Hamlet was the first, and then the remaining plays in the sequence, Othello, Lear, and Macbeth, those are regarded as a group as Shakespeare's great tragedies. So in 1603, as I said earlier, Queen Elizabeth dies. She dies in March, and she's succeeded by James Stuart, James I, the beginning of the Stuart monarchy. Shortly after his coronation, Shakespeare's company, which for years had been the Lord Chamberlain's Men, is rechartered as the King's Men. So they are now the official theater company of the king himself. In 1607, Pericles is performed. This is the first of the so-called romance plays. This term, we'll talk more about this term in another lecture, but this is really the beginning of the decline in Shakespeare's career. He writes fewer plays. He becomes less involved in the theater. In 1609, his sonnets are published, perhaps without Shakespeare's involvement or approval. And in 1610, the King's Men begin their winter performances at the indoor theater of Blackfriars. So indoor theaters were completely different. They required candlelight, of course. The candles had to be changed periodically during the performance, so plays now began to be divided into acts or intervals. Gradually, at this point, Shakespeare becomes less involved in theater and shifts his attention to his post-playwriting career plans and his extensive Stratford properties. So Blackfriars, a little bit of more information about the Blackfriars Theater. This was the site of a Dominican monastery dating back to the 13th century. The property itself, which was a complex of buildings, came into possession of the crown in 1538 after Henry VIII disbanded Catholic orders and seized church assets and properties. By the middle of the 16th century, the site provided workrooms, storage space, and residential quarters even for the office of Master of the Revels. As I said before, James Burbage purchased part of the site in 1596 with the idea of creating an indoor venue for the Lord Chamberlain's men to use during the winter months. The outdoor theaters did not do as well in the winter. The fewer daylight hours, which then required people to travel in the dark greater distances out of the city. It's just hugely inconvenient, and they wanted to have a venue that was indoors, more suitable for wintertime. But as I said before, this project wound up being delayed for years due to new city ordinance prohibiting adult theater companies from performing within city limits. In 1613, the Globe Theater, the original one, burned down. There was a cannon malfunction during a performance of Henry VIII. A spark or something got into the thatch, and the theater went up in flames, and miraculously everybody got out. I don't know. Maybe it was a small crowd. I don't know. It seems like they were very lucky that nobody was hurt in that incident. The theater was rebuilt shortly after this time with a tile roof, and Shakespeare continued to be a shareholder in the company and probably helped finance that reconstruction. In 1616, after a short illness, he dies. Shakespeare dies on his birthday. He was 52 years old, which is the age I am now as I speak into the microphone here. He was buried in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford. There's a nice picture of the church as it stands today. And here is Shakespeare's gravesite within the church. Next to him on the left there is his wife, Anne. And finally, the last date I'm going to mention is 1623, a hugely important date, the publication of Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, otherwise known as the First Folio. And I'm not going to say much about it here because I'm going to talk more extensively about it later in this lecture. But this is, without this book, we would be missing half of Shakespeare's dramatic output. So a hugely important publication. So with that, we'll transition now to talking about early editions of William Shakespeare's plays. So before we get into specific editions, early editions of Shakespeare's work, I want to talk a little bit about how books were made in the early modern period. And what you see on the screen here is a Renaissance printing house. This is a fantastic image. It's contemporary with Shakespeare's time, right around 1600. And it's wonderful. It shows us basically the full operation inside a printing house. Some of the details in this image are mysterious to me. Like there are lots of weapons about, but it gives us a kind of narrative of how a book made it from manuscript to printed material. So on the left, the far left of the screen, you see these gentlemen sitting here. They are working from manuscript materials, which you see posted up on the wall. And there's a man there gesturing at those manuscript pages. And they're using those materials to compose the text. They're called compositors. And what they did was they took small pieces of metal type called sorts, and basically started assembling them into the text that would be taken to the printing press. And these sorts were stored in compartmentalized type cases like this one. So you can see that that's what they have in front of them at their workstation. And then once the material was printed, these sorts would be dumped into a box, and they would get replaced back into the type cases, probably by a poor apprentice who spent tedious hours doing that. In the foreground is another compositor, and you can see a little more clearly in this part of the image that he is using what is called a composing stick to arrange the type into lines. This is what a composing stick actually looks like there on the right. You can see it's a pretty painstaking procedure to create lines of text using metal type. Once these lines were completed, they would be packed into a heavy metal chase or a form, they were called, and these could withstand the intense pressure of the printing press. Here is a photograph of one. Just what looks like, I think, just a broadside there, just one giant page. And that's what would be taken to the press. And the paper would be set on top, and the press the printer would lower the platen and press the paper against the type. Before it got to that point, though, it had to be inked, and there's the inker back there. He's got ink balls that were used to apply ink to the type set inside the form, and then again the form went to the press. And it looks like the biggest, burliest member of this printing house is the one responsible for operating that screw press. So a sheet of paper was laid on the freshly inked form, and then the operator lowered the platen, applying enough pressure to transfer the ink to the paper, obviously. And you can see there's a young person, perhaps an apprentice down below there, who is taking the printed sheets. Not clear what he is doing with them, but there's another individual up here on the left with spectacles on, a proofreader, who would check the printed sheet or proof for accuracy. If the proofreader found errors, the form could be removed from the press and returned to the compositors for corrections, and then go from the compositors back to the inker and back to the press. So what this meant in early modern text was that very frequently they didn't throw away misprinted sheets. They would just get bound in with the book. So what happens is you get press variants. Even the 1623 folio of Shakespeare, almost no two examples of the folio are the same, because there are hundreds of press variants where the forms were removed, something was fixed, a word was changed or moved, and then it went back to the press, and the printing process would continue. He's wearing, those probably are not corrective lenses, but special spectacles to magnify the text to ease the proofreading process. Once the printing was complete, the signatures or gatherings were collated and assembled into books ready for the marketplace. And this is how you would buy a book. And this was true into the 18th century. You know, you would go to the bookseller and you would buy your book unbound. Once you bought it, you took it to a binder. This was a completely different operation with specialized labor of its own. The treating, the preparing of animal skins, the sewing, the marbling of end papers. Bookbinding itself was a complicated craft, and so once you purchased a book at that time, it was your responsibility to then have it bound. That was a separate expense. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how books were put together, how they were assembled after they were printed on the press. And I want to talk about book sizes a little bit first. Sometimes I talk about folios and quartos and octavos, and students often ask me, what are those things? Basically, it's just the size of the book. The more folds the sheet of paper, the more folds required to create pages, the smaller and smaller the book gets. So the larger books are called folios, which usually involve just one fold. And so the pages are really large. The books are really large. This is a set of Shakespeare. This is one of 9 volumes of Shakespeare. And I think every time I move it, it's a chore. I think altogether it weighs 75, 80 pounds. Just to give you a sense of scale here, there's a copy of my Oxford Shakespeare Loves Labour's Lost, which I put on top of the folio to help you see the size. And even that doesn't really convey how large these books are. The next size down is the quarto, and most of Shakespeare's early plays, there are some octavos, but most of them are in the quarto format you see here, which is 2 folds instead of 1 to give you signatures of 8 pages. And I'm going to demonstrate that for you in a moment. And then one size down from that would be the octavo. This is an 1805 edition of Shakespeare. And then smaller than that even is duodecimo. And books did get even smaller than this. And there are some different sizes in between, but these are the 4 main book sizes: folio, quarto, octavo, and duodecimo. So how did the pages then get into the books? So here is a sheet of paper which is printed with the first 8 pages of Shakespeare's Loves Labour's Lost. This was the first play that carried his name on the title page of the work. His name did appear in his poems, Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece, but it appeared on the dedication page, not the title page. So this is the first, this sheet of paper contains the first 8 pages. And you say, well, I see only 4 there. And that's because obviously the printer would turn the paper over and print on the other side as well. So this side is called the recto side. We'll call this sheet A. And then the back side is the verso side of sheet A. And that gives us the 8 pages. So when these pages are folded, you will see page 1. There are the fold lines I put in there. Page 1 is on the recto side, and then pages 2 and 3 would be on the verso. Pages 4 and 5 back on the recto, 6 and 7 on the verso, and then page 8, the last page on this sheet, would be adjacent to the first page. So to help with constructing the forms and with the assembly of the book, there are a couple of interesting features that I will point out to you. If you look at page 5, which is upside down, up there at the top, there is what's called a signature mark. What that says is A3, capital A and the number 3. These are called signatures or signature marks. And these would appear when the pages are folded properly. The signature marks should appear in order: A1, A2, A3, A4 on the rectos of the pages on the right side. So if you want to see another signature mark, there's one on page 7, which you can see there at the bottom, A4. Another help for printers and binders were catchwords. So if you look at page 4 at the top, there's the word swear, and this is called a catchword. It's not part of the text proper. what it does is it signals what the first word of the next page should be. So if you look at page 5, which I know is upside down, but the word swear is the first word on page 5. So the signature marks and the catchwords would help with creating the forms, with the printing and the assembling of the book. If you want to see another catchword, you can look at page 7. The catchword there is enter, which is actually a stage direction. And if you want to pause and try and find that catchword, you will find it on page 8. And there it is. Enter. Enter a constable with costard with a letter. So it's probably a little hard to follow this without actually doing it, without actually working with printed material. So what I've done is created a video for you that shows me assembling, folding and cutting sheet A to assemble the first signature of Love's Labour's Lost. So I'll talk you through it here. There it is after it's finished. So here, obviously, this is not a quarto. This is not a full-size sheet of paper. It's just a piece of typing paper. So it would be larger than this. But I'm making my first fold there. And I'm keeping the title page on my right side. And then I make my second fold. So now all the pages after these two folds are facing the same direction and they are in the proper order. I'm being a little fastidious with my folds there. So now I haven't opened the pages yet because you still see the folds, so you can't actually turn all of the pages. So those will have to be cut. So this is called opening the pages. Use a sharp instrument when you're doing this. I'm cutting 2 folds. There's cutting fold number 1 and cutting fold number 2. And this will give me the first complete gathering or signature of the play. I went ahead and did the second one as well, the B sheet. So now I've got 2 gatherings, and at the bookbinder, they would simply place one on top of the other and sew them into a book. The folio, there were other books a little more complicated with gatherings inserted inside of gatherings, but this one is pretty straightforward. And so when you flip through, you can look at the signatures and you'll see they're in proper order. There's the catchword and it's in its proper place, and there at the bottom you see the A4 signature. There's A3, A4, B, B2, B3, and B4, and that gives us the first 16 pages of Love's Labour's Lost. And that's how early modern books were put together. We're going to look at some more title pages in just a minute, so I want to talk first about where books were printed, published, and sold in London. Most of them were sold in around St. Paul's Cathedral, and that doesn't mean there weren't printers and booksellers elsewhere in London, but there was a huge concentration of them around St. Paul's. In this edition of Venus and Adonis, this was the first Shakespeare publication, Venus and Adonis in 1593, and you can see at the bottom we're told that it was imprinted by Richard Field and sold at the sign of the White Greyhound in Paul's Churchyard. And you'll see that Paul's Churchyard is mentioned on many title pages, not just in Shakespeare's publications, but in a lot of early modern books. Paul's Churchyard is mentioned. And here's a map, another map of London, and there's obviously St. Paul's. And there are several reasons, I think, for this. One of them is that the Stationers' Company, which we haven't talked about yet. We'll talk about the Stationers' Company in just a minute, but the Stationers' Company was headquartered near St. Paul's. And then all around on these adjacent streets, there were printers and booksellers. And it was a good place to market printed material too. A lot of the material that booksellers published was religious in nature. So being next to the most important church in London would be a good opportunity to make sure that your religious material was being marketed effectively. So intellectual property rights were much different from what we would expect today. And I talked a little bit about this earlier, but it's important to remember that playwrights had no artistic or legal control over their work, which after they wrote it, it was typically sold to the theater company, at which point all their rights transferred to the company shareholders, including the right to publish the play. So there were several reasons why a company might choose to publish a play, and by publish I mean they would sell the rights to it to a publisher. And there were several reasons why a company might do this. One, to capitalize on an especially popular play, or to capitalize on one that was once popular but was no longer included in the company's most current repertory. Another likely scenario is that publishing plays provided an alternative source of revenue during theater closures, during the outbreaks of plague, such as the outbreaks that occurred in the years 1593-94, which is when Shakespeare published his two major long poems and Titus Andronicus. And another possibility is that publishing plays allowed companies to raise funds for large capital projects, like theater building, or perhaps expanding their costuming. 8 different Shakespeare plays were published from 1599 to 1600. This was the peak period of Shakespeare publication. And this may have helped finance construction of the Globe Theater. That's one theory. It seems plausible to me. So throughout the Renaissance, the publishing industry was regulated by an organization known as the Stationers' Company. I mentioned the Stationers' Company before. This was a trade association that operated under a royal charter, sort of like a guild. So to publish a book, or at least to publish a book and claim the right to be the exclusive publisher of that book, a bookseller first had to register the title with the Stationers' Company, at which point he assumed exclusive printing rights. And then he also had the right to sell those rights to another bookseller later, if he so chose. So authorial copyright would not come about until the 18th century. The Stationers' Company also had the authority, interestingly, to prohibit and confiscate objectionable titles, and they could even arrest offending book publishers. During the Jacobean period, the office of the Master of the Revels also extended its oversight to include the publication as well as performance of plays, as I mentioned earlier. So now there were two mechanisms in place to oversee and control the content of printed plays. Once a title of a play was entered into the Stationer's Register, the seller or publisher partnered with a printer to actually manufacture the book. And some of the printers were also booksellers themselves. So prior to 1623, the year of the first folio, 18 of Shakespeare's plays, that is half of the first folio's contents, had been published in quarto format. And some of them were published multiple times. The history plays were especially popular. They were the most popular plays during Shakespeare's early career, the history plays. And there were as many as 6 separate editions of Richard III and the first part of Henry IV between 1597 and 1622. More than half of the 55 known quarto editions are history plays. So while All print editions of Shakespeare are valuable. Some of the quartos are highly problematic, and a few of them, they're known to scholars today as the bad quartos, are absolute mutilations, but still fascinating in various ways in their own right. One problem arising from this complicated publication history, from company to bookseller, from bookseller to bookseller, multiple editions of plays, is what happens is we see tremendous textual variation between different editions of the same play. Individual words can be changed, added, or even deleted. Entire scenes even might be extended or rearranged or even removed altogether. So then questions arise as to which version represents the true Shakespeare. Questions whether that truth can ever be ascertained, or really if it even matters. These questions have vexed scholars for centuries now. Many of the textual variants have legitimate explanations, some of which we've already talked about. But deliberate textual amendment is the most interesting. It's likely that some changes were made to plays later in response to the constraints of the performance or the venue of the performance, time constraints, the number of actors available, the constraints of the venue. These are things that could have necessitated changes to a play. The composition or disposition of the audience could have necessitated changes, or new rules affecting theatrical performance, like there was a law passed. I can't remember what year. I think it was during the Jacobean period, against certain swear words that were then removed from later editions of Shakespeare's plays, or just the political climate itself. Shakespeare was more careful than some of his contemporaries to avoid controversy. And while many of the changes may be attributed to Shakespeare himself, some of these changes bear the stamp of other playwrights. Then there are sort of the accidental textual changes. Book production required painstaking labor from individuals working long hours, poor conditions, probably tight deadlines. It was not uncommon for type to be set by several compositors at once. We know that the folio, the 1623 folio, which is a luxuriantly produced text, had at least 5 different compositors working on it at a time. And each one of them had their own idiosyncratic spelling of words and grammatical tics. And it's got to be remembered as well that compositors were working from rough manuscript sources that could be themselves wildly inconsistent in spelling, punctuation, lineation, stage directions, and even speech prefixes. And Shakespeare scholars spend a lot of time paying attention to those kinds of variations. So here is a typical early modern title page. This is for the quarto edition of Titus Andronicus. This was the first play published, Shakespeare play that we know of that was published. So usually the title would appear at the top. You're going to see a notable exception to that in a few minutes. The title would appear at the top. And then the play's attribution, whether to a theater company or to a playwright, would appear below that. Then there'd be these interesting emblems, a printer's mark or printer's device that identified. Every printer had their own. They're wonderful to study. And then below the printer's device, the actual name of the printer and the bookseller and the location where the books could be procured. And then finally, the date at the very bottom. That's fairly typical for an early modern title page. So we're looking at Titus Andronicus here. This is published in 1594. This is the earliest quarto of a play by Shakespeare. And in fact, this is the only one in existence. It's at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. The early quartos do not credit Shakespeare as the author, as I said earlier. Rather, they identify the theater company or companies that claimed rights to the script or performed the play. The year 1594 is also significant because it's the patent year for the Lord Chamberlain's men. They are not mentioned on the title page of this 1594 edition of Titus Andronicus. However, I'm going to put up the second quarto edition of the same play in 1600. Different printer, different bookseller. And you'll notice that there is a different printer's device there. Again, a different printer, Jonathan Richards. But the most interesting change to this title page is that now the play is associated with Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's men. So we'll look at a few other quarto title pages here. Here's Love's Labour's Lost, which I used earlier to demonstrate how a quarto would be assembled after the printing of its sheets, of its pages. Shakespeare, as I said, had gone public as the author of Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece, but this was the first play published with his name on the title page. And it's interesting that there's no mention of the Lord Chamberlain's men here, just Shakespeare's name. Still, this was putting his name on the title page like this was clearly a clear indication that Shakespeare's reputation was very high, and that would be a point of a selling point, a way to market the play. But to enhance the play's appeal, the publisher also made sure to mention that it had been performed before the Queen during the Christmas season. The Christmas time was the weeks around Christmas, the Christmas holiday, were popular times for feasting and celebrations and the performance of plays. So here is a later quarto. This is the King Lear quarto from 1608. And one of the things you'll notice right away is that Shakespeare's fame and reputation could not be more evident than here, where it's placed above the title of the play itself and in the largest typeface. Mr. William Shakespeare, Master William Shakespeare, his true chronicle history of the life and death of King Lear and his three daughters. This notably full title page takes the additional step of singling out the character of Edgar, who may have been especially popular with contemporary playgoers. And so that was another marketing gimmick, one might say. And again, when somebody purchased this, what they would see is a bundle of signatures, and this would be the title page that would be visible. No cover with art to look at. There is the additional endorsement of court performance, this time for King James at Whitehall. This was a popular venue for the Stuart court. It was also the venue for his son's beheading during the English Civil Wars. Again, during the Christmas holidays. And then finally, we see Shakespeare's company is identified as, again, now as the King's men, not as the Lord Chamberlain's men, His Majesty's servants. And also, it's interesting because this title page mentions their usual venue, the Globe Theater on the Bankside. So really full and interesting title page here. And we'll look more at these in different lectures as we get into the individual plays. So the last quarto we're going to look at is the quarto. This is the first quarto edition of Hamlet. Shakespeare's probably his most famous play. This is the first quarto published in 1603, and it is one of the bad quartos. And we're not going to get into the details of that in this lecture, But I do want to point out something that's rather interesting about this title page. As it hath been diverse times acted by his highness servants in the city of London, as also in the two universities of Cambridge and Oxford, and elsewhere. Now, we'll come back to that in a moment, but what's important to note here is that this is evidence that Shakespeare's company did tour outside of London, probably during the winter seasons, when it was, when it was more of a struggle to get people into the Globe Theater on the Bankside. They would go on tour, and also during periods of theater closure, they would go on tour around the countryside. So they would take their show on the road. But I'm going to put up another quarto. Now, this quarto was published by the same man, Nicholas Ling. His initials NL appear at the bottom of both. And the second quarto, Q2, appeared in 1604, just a few months after the first one. And this quarto is much different from the bad quarto of Hamlet. And you can see on the title page, it says, newly imprinted and enlarged to almost as much again as it was, according to the true and perfect copy. So this is fascinating. The same publisher with a different printer the second time comes up with a title page that markets the book in a very different way. So the first quarto of Hamlet on the left, notoriously bad and bears little resemblance to the true and perfect copy issued several months later by the same publisher, Nicholas Ling, but with the printer James Roberts instead, so a new printer. This is perhaps the result of fierce competition between booksellers to quickly bring a print version of the play to market. That's just speculation on my part, but plausible. Noteworthy on the first quarto title page is the mention again of the performances at Oxford and Cambridge, which suggests that Shakespeare's company may have left London for a time, perhaps after the failed Essex Rebellion of 1601, or perhaps during the Queen's decline in early 1603, during her illness. Leading up to her death, there were new prohibitions against performances of plays in and around London, so perhaps they took Hamlet on the road at that point as well. So this brings us to the folio, Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, published according to their true original copies. So prior to Shakespeare's death in 1616, only about half of his known plays had appeared in print. The other half, including famous works, Twelfth Night, Macbeth, Julius Caesar, The Tempest, appeared for the first time ever in the 1623 folio. So due to the volume's comprehensiveness and the extraordinary care that went into assembling and editing its contents, it serves as the base text for most contemporary editions of Shakespeare, although I'll qualify that saying that's not without complications and controversies. There are, however, notable omissions from the first folio. There are several important plays, The Two Noble Kinsmen, Pericles, King Edward III. These are now generally regarded as Shakespeare's or plays to which he made significant contributions, but they are not included in the folio. And of course, the poetry, Shakespeare's poetry, is entirely missing from the 1623 folio. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this to wrap up this lecture. So quality paper was not easy to come by. It had to be imported. It was extraordinarily expensive. So to print a work in this large format involved significant financial risk to the publisher. If you were going to spend this much money to make a book, you wanted to make sure it could sell. And it took 9 years for the Shakespeare folio to sell out. Folio editions of literary work were therefore relatively uncommon during this period, and Shakespeare's was in fact the first that was exclusively dramatic work. Michael Drayton and Ben Jonson had also published folios before 1623, but their folios included poetry as well. Michael Drayton's was mostly poetry, in fact. So for an author to have his work published in the folio format was certainly a mark of cultural prestige. So a book of this size and expense was probably printed in an edition of 750. A census of surviving copies today gives us only 275. The rest are presumed lost or destroyed. 82 of these copies are currently housed in one place, the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. The last copy of the first folio to appear at public auction sold with a hammer price of $10 million. So you can imagine that the 1623 folio has been the subject of attempted heists and forgeries for years, and there are interesting documentaries about some of those you can find online. So it was printed by Isaac Jaggard and Edward Blunt. Again, 1623. Isaac Jaggard was the son of the printer bookseller William Jaggard. The elder Jaggard is quite notorious among Shakespeare scholars for the poetry anthology The Passionate Pilgrim, which he printed in 1599. And it contained pirated poems by Shakespeare, as well as poems that were misattributed to Shakespeare. Poems by Christopher Marlowe, for example, or Richard Barnfield were called Shakespeare's poems, and they weren't. William Jaggard went on to publish several quarto editions, numerous in fact, quarto editions of Shakespeare's plays throughout the early 17th century, but died shortly before his son, Isaac, brought the folio to completion. Isaac's partner, Edward Blunt, is an interesting printer as well. He'd once been apprenticed to William Ponsonby, who in the 1590s was responsible for publishing important works by the likes of Sir Philip Sidney and Edmund Spenser. He was the printer of The Faerie Queen, in fact. Published according to the true original copies. So the volumes claim to authenticity and accuracy is, of course, a marketing ploy, and perhaps also somewhat disingenuous, depending on what one assumes is meant by the phrase true original copies. We know it is impossible that the folio text was prepared entirely from original holograph materials, that is, Shakespeare's own manuscripts. But in addition to Shakespeare's foul papers, these were final drafts of plays called foul papers, the editors of the 1623 folio, both of them members of Shakespeare's company, the King's Men, likely relied on other kinds of sources as well. And those sources probably included prompt books that were used by the actors. These were probably transcribed from the foul papers in Shakespeare's autograph. Reliable early quarto editions of the plays we know were used as well. And then, of course, the memories of Shakespeare's fellow actors and collaborators were probably consulted to create this text. The men responsible for compiling and preparing the manuscript materials for Jaggard's workshop were John Hemmings and Henry Condell. And as I said, both of these men were members of Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men and later the King's Men. And they were lifelong friends of Shakespeare, and both of them were included in his will. I think they were the only other members of his company who were included in his will. Here's a list of the names of the principal actors. This is one of the pages in the 1623 folio, and you can see that William Shakespeare is dutifully listed at the top, followed by the company's most famous actor, Richard Burbage, who was in fact dead by this time, by 1623. And then below that is we see John Hemmings and Henry Condell listed there. Another interesting feature of the 1623 folio are the dedicatory poems that appear at the beginning of them. The most famous one is this one, "To the memory of my beloved, the author, Mr. William Shakespeare, and what he hath left us." This was a poem written in couplets by Ben Jonson. And Jonson is widely regarded and was regarded at the time as the second most influential Renaissance playwright after Shakespeare. He achieved great success and a lot of trouble for himself, as I told you earlier, writing satirical city comedies. And this was a genre that Shakespeare seemed intent to avoid. Nevertheless, Shakespeare as an actor, we know that he played roles in several of Jonson's early plays that were put on by Shakespeare's company. This poem written by Jonson includes the really famous lines to Shakespeare: "Thou art a monument without a tomb, and art alive still while thy book doth live, and we have wits to read and praise to give." So another interesting feature of the 1623 folio is the dedication page, dedicated to two men, brothers, both of them nephews, I guess distant nephews of Sir Philip Sidney. Not direct nephews, I misspoke, but related to Sir Philip Sidney through his sister, Mary Sidney. So the Earl of Pembroke up here, William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke, and then Philip Herbert. Both of them were Lord Chamberlain to the British monarchy, and they're carrying the baton. Both of them are holding the baton of the Lord Chamberlain there, and so the folio was dedicated to them because of their affiliation with the company, the theater company. Here is the table of contents page for the 1623 folio. There are some sort of notable things about it. Most modern scholarly editions of Shakespeare organize the plays chronologically. That is in order of their composition or performance based on the best available evidence that we have, which is sometimes pretty speculative. The Tempest, classified by most modern editors as a romance, was Shakespeare's last play, but in the folio it appears first as one of the comedies. The remaining plays are divided between comedies, histories, and tragedies. The histories are arranged according to royal chronology, starting with King John and ending with King Henry VIII. And I think with that, we can conclude this presentation on playing and publishing in Shakespeare's England.